Good evening. How many of you have heard the term oxymoron? But we heard that term, but do you know what it means? I guess put in the simplest way possible, an oxymoron is putting contradictory terms together. And let's consider a few examples that we sometimes say. Second best is an oxymoron. An exact estimate. Freezer burn. Hopelessly optimistic. Alone together. Pretty ugly. Awfully nice. Non-dairy creamer. Plastic silverware. Near miss. Metal wood if you're a golfer. And for you beach people, jumbo shrimp. So those are some oxymorons. There are some oxymorons that were never intended to be put together, but because of our perception of them, they do seem to be a contradiction in terms at times. Things like government intelligence sometimes seems to be a contradiction in terms. So is airline food. An unbiased opinion. You can probably think of many more that you have heard. An oxymoron is putting two words together that just seem to contradict one another. And our Lord Himself in Luke chapter 10 is doing this. He is putting forth this oxymoron of His own. At least it would have been an oxymoron to any Jew that was hearing it as He spoke it that day. The Jews would have seen the words good and Samaritan as completely contradictory to each other. Those two words should never be put together in the Jewish mind of the first century. You see, there was great hostility between these two groups of people. The ordinary Jew viewed Samaritans as half-breeds, both physically and spiritually. There was bigotry, there was prejudice, there was deep-seated feelings of hatred and animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. The name Samaritan was also used sometimes in a way to describe someone who was a heretic or a breaker of religious ceremony. You may even remember that in John chapter 8 and verse 48, the Pharisees called Jesus a Samaritan and a demon, as if those two things were almost synonymous with one another, that Jesus would be considered both of those because they did not like what He was saying. It certainly was not a compliment. To use an adjective like good to describe a Samaritan would have been absolutely absurd to the Jewish people, because the ordinary Jew just simply saw nothing good in them. It was so bad that when they traveled north and south, say when Jesus came from Nazareth, or they came from Capernaum, and they were going to Jerusalem for those feast days, they would go far out of their way. The quickest way was right through Samaria and to Jerusalem, but they would go cross the Jordan River, go down the bank of the Jordan River, come back across the Jordan River at Jericho, and come up to Jerusalem, all in an effort to avoid going through the land of Samaria. That's why it's so unique and so wonderful when we see that Jesus went through that land. He didn't take that route. He didn't view people like that. But instead, He would go through Samaria. He would talk to the woman at the well. And there would be other instances as well when He was there. But when we look at the parable in Luke chapter 10, beginning with verse 25, we have to set up why Jesus told this parable. We all know the story. We all know the parable. But I think sometimes we do not really know the point that Jesus is making. The question that He is answering. The whole parable is an answer to a question. And so it behooves us to know what the question was, so that we can better understand the answer. A lawyer, an expert in the law of Moses at that time, begins questioning Jesus by asking Him what he must do to inherit eternal life. And it's the greatest question that a person can ask if they're asking sincerely. You remember, it's the same question that the rich young ruler would ask, but he was very sincere in his desire to know this. That is not the case with this particular man. The lawyer was not asking in sincerity. He was not seeking salvation. He was seeking to trap Jesus in some kind of inconsistency or contradiction to what was already perceived to be the proper answer to the question. And so Jesus, like He does so many times in His ministry, He asks a question to answer a question, right? He looks at this lawyer, and why wouldn't you ask a lawyer this? This is the guy that's the expert, right? You're an expert on the law. You're coming to ask me about it. Jesus says, what is written in the law? So this has to make this man feel pretty good. He's deferring to me. He's going to ask me what it is. And the lawyer responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So he gives that answer as what he sees in the law as that which needs to be done. And this was the right answer. And so Jesus tells him that he has answered correctly, and then he admonishes him to do this. He says, do this and you will live. Well, you see, as a rule, the lawyers of Jesus' time were long on theory and very short on action. It's one thing to know the law. It's entirely another thing to do what the law says. And so this lawyer, who was feigning respect when he came up, respect for Jesus and attempting to put him to the test, all of a sudden he finds himself now on the defensive end of this situation. He's now on the defensive. Jesus has turned it on him now, and he's on the defensive. This interchange was not going the way that he expected. He has now been ensnared in the very trap that he laid for Jesus. The lawyer knew that he had not kept the law perfectly toward his neighbor. So therefore he sought a way of soothing his conscience by asking the question. And the question is an effort to seek a technicality. He's looking for a technicality to do away with the law of God. Here's the question. And who is my neighbor? Well, the Pharisees and the scribes knew the Old Testament Scriptures. Knew them very well, in fact. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18 reads, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. They knew this passage, but the rabbis had been attempting to define who a neighbor is. Who is that? What does that person look like? And at their worst and narrowest, they confined that word neighbor to being only Jews. That the only people that were really neighbors, according to the law, would be another Jew, and everybody else doesn't count. The Pharisees thought, they took it down even closer. The Pharisees thought your neighbor had to be a Pharisee to be a neighbor, for that really to apply. They were a little more constricted in their thought. Some Jews would even go as far to teach that it was illegal to help a Gentile woman who was giving birth, because all you would be doing is aiding another Gentile to come into the world. Can you imagine that kind of mindset? Therefore, the lawyer questions Jesus to clearly define who his neighbor is. And Jesus, of course, answers him with the parable, as we call it, of the Good Samaritan. A certain Hebrew man was traveling through the 20 mile long road that led through a barren, very narrow, lots of crags and narrow areas for them to go through, that went from Jerusalem down to the city of Jericho. He's traveling down that road, and he falls among robbers. And they attack him, and they strip him, and they assault him, and they leave him half dead on the side of the road. As he was lying there, a priest came upon him, but passed by on the other side, as did a Levite, the priest's helper. He comes and passes by on the other side of the road. You know, the irony of Jesus' story is that the two most likely candidates to help this man, the people at the very heart and the center of the religion that God had established, the priest and the Levite, these are the two most likely candidates that would help this man, and yet they do not. And understand this. This man that is hurt is not a Samaritan. Even by that rule that your neighbor's a Jew, that would apply here. Because this man was a Jewish man. And so they do not help him, but instead they just kept on walking. They thought to themselves maybe that this tragedy was not their fault. It was none of their affair. They just were going to mind their own business and let that man lay there on the ground. Perhaps the priest, as we try to think about reasons why somebody might do something, perhaps the priest could not be certain if the man was dead. And knowing that anyone who touched a dead man would be rendered unclean for 7 days, according to Numbers chapter 19 and verse 11, he decided not to risk becoming unclean and therefore being unable to then serve in the temple worship. And one would think that if the priest wouldn't stop to help, that certainly the Levite following him would not either. But like the priest, he simply walks on by choosing to not be involved. So neither the priest nor the Levite showed compassion. But they should have. They should have, because they knew the law. And a basic Old Testament command was to show mercy to a person in need. Really, no matter what the priest thought, no matter what the Levite thought, their actions in this parable, they are inexcusable. There is no reason that is justifiable for them to walk by. They knew the law and they chose to do nothing. They saw a neighbor in need and they did not seize the opportunity to help him. Instead, it is the half-breed, despised Samaritan, the living, breathing oxymoron, who came upon the injured man and was moved to compassion. We have to also think that just as the woman at the well was surprised that a Jewish man would talk to her because she's a woman and because she was a Samaritan, that Jewish man laying there may very well have had total contempt for a Samaritan. And yet it really wasn't about the man laying on the road, it was about the man that was looking at him. That's really what mattered. And so this Samaritan is moved to compassion. The people who should have stopped and helped the man did not. They walked on past it as if they had not seen a thing. But the irony of all ironies was that the hated Samaritan became the hero of Jesus' story. He did what the others would not. Not only did he administer first aid, if you will, that might have been if you just did that, you would say, well, that was an awful kind thing to do, right? To stop and to render first aid. But he doesn't just do that. Yes, he renders that first aid to him to help the man, but then he takes the man and he takes him to a hotel or to an inn, and he leaves him there with the money and says, if I owe anything more when I come back, I will settle it up with you. And so he doesn't just do the bare minimum. He goes the extra mile. Now, he stopped to help. He did more than just help. One message that we, the readers today, can glean from this parable is that it's not good enough to say you love your neighbor. You must be willing to show it when the opportunity arises. It's very similar to James's argument about saying, seeing someone hungry and in need and saying, be warm and be filled, and walking off. He said, really, what good is that? What good does it do for us to say, we love our neighbor, I love my neighbor, and I love God and I love my neighbor, but then we have people in need and we do nothing? And we are no better than the priest. We're no better than the Levite. We have to bring these teachings that Jesus gives to us to a personal level as to how does this apply to my life and my daily living. Real compassion requires compassionate deeds. It's not enough to merely feel sorry for an individual in need. I'm sure that the priest and the Levite, I'm sure somewhere deep down in their cold hearts, they had some pity for the wounded man, but it didn't move them to do anything. Compassion must be demonstrated through the deeds in order for it to have its full effect. You know, there were times, and I love when people act like the only way that, Jesus ever healed anybody was because of their faith. That's not the case. The blind man in John chapter 9 didn't even know who Jesus was when Jesus healed him. And there are times when Jesus saw the crowds, and the Bible simply said, He had compassion and healed them all. Had nothing to do with them, had everything to do with who He was as the compassionate Son of God. You know, Jesus closes His story in verse 36 by asking the scribe, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And the lawyer answers him by saying, the one who showed mercy toward him. Notice that the lawyer could not even bring himself to say Samaritan. Did you catch that? The one who showed compassion. The one who showed mercy. Couldn't even say the word Samaritan. Though the lawyer couldn't bring himself to utter that word, he got the point that Jesus was trying to make. And Jesus immediately follows up that point with, go and do likewise. And all of his efforts to trap Jesus only condemned him. Because Jesus understood why he was asking the question. And folks, Jesus says that same thing to us today. It applies to us today. Go and do likewise. Those are His words. For us to be people of compassion. Who is my neighbor? That's the question. Is it my new neighbors that I have on each side of my house? Is that the limit? The person directly over the fence behind my house? Is that my neighbors? I mean, I know we kind of have an exclusive definition to that term, to the people that live immediately around us, but really it's much, much broader than that. Jesus, in this parable, is saying to us that our neighbor is every person that we come upon. We are to love all, and we are to serve all, no matter what their nationality is, no matter what their race is. None of that even matters, and no matter what they've done. Once again, our actions are not driven by the person that we're acting toward. It's driven by who we are. And we're either that good, compassionate person that is good and compassionate in every situation, or we're not. And so we have to always say, this is about who I want to be, not about who that person may be. And so we look at people around us, and when despite the fact that they might not walk, talk, or look exactly like us, we are to be people that love them, show compassion to them, and long to see them saved. Long to see them healed as this man was by the actions of this Samaritan. Jesus sees all people as having value. And if I want to wear that name Christian, a name that means Christ-like, I want to be like my Savior, then I have to view people the very same way. Is that easy? Not always. Sometimes it's pretty hard. But Jesus didn't have a life of ease either. And neither should we expect to. But He still showed those things, that kindness, that compassion, even hanging on the cross. That repeated statement. He didn't just say it once. He said it over and over and over again. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. How can you have compassion on people that were so cruel? Because it wasn't about them. It was about the one hanging on the cross. The one we emulate in our lives. We are to see people just like Him. We are to love our neighbor because of who they are. They are a person that is created in the image of God, just like you and me. Who is my neighbor? Well, it's everyone I'm looking at right now, and a lot more. This evening, it is our desire that our neighbor, from our love, we want you to come to Jesus Christ. Whatever you need to do this evening to make that a reality, we hope and pray that you will do it. We hope and pray that you'll come now as we stand and as we sing. Rise up and